Welcome. Welcome to Lyon. Welcome to the 12th edition of Biovision with a theme from global health to One Health. Biovision is all about innovation, so it is important for Biovision to offer an innovative format to stick to priorities, to stick to challenges for the life sciences and health sectors. Always with a commitment to transform innovative ideas into a solution for the benefit of citizens. After having boosted action in 2013 with Biovision Catalyzer and Biovision Investor, the keywords of this edition are act and interact, share ideas, debate, and discover.
Let me at the outset express my gratitude to the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And I'm particularly happy that we have the theme of Biovision as the major subject that we're going to be discussing. My guru and economist who was well ahead of his time, Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, clearly believed that the future of human society lies in a bioeconomic future. And I think that's going to be particularly important if we have to deal with climate change and its worsening impacts. So I'm going to give you a few slides very briefly to tell you why it's extremely important to deal with this growing challenge. Mr. Ban Ki-moon, the former Secretary General of the UN, very rightly labeled this as the defining challenge of our time. And I want to tell you, there was mention of the COP21. I have been to every COP except the one in Marrakesh because frankly I thought nothing's going to come out of it. And when I was chair of the IPCC for 13 years, I had to speak in the opening session of every COP. I've reached the conclusion that governments are not going to solve this problem. It's taken 25 years since the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we're really nowhere. I was mentioning earlier that in the year 2000, emissions of greenhouse gases were 39 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. In 2010, there were 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent. So we're going in the wrong direction. And Gandhi rightly said, speed is irrelevant if you're going in the wrong direction. So this is what we're doing. Now, I want to say that the only way to deal with this problem is to mobilize the youth of the world, because it's their future which is at stake, and I'll say a little more about that. So let's go to the next slide. This gives you a picture of the increase in temperature that has taken place. Can we project it on the slide? Yes. You see there are fluctuations over here, and these are the result of natural changes. There are there's solar activity, there's volcanic activity, and other factors which are really part of the natural cycle. And therefore, you have these ups and downs, you have these fluctuations. But what is particularly significant is the rate at which temperatures have increased since the middle of the last century. And this is where I think human society is now impacting on the climate in a manner that's producing very serious impacts. And it's not just a smooth and steady increase in temperature. Climate change is accompanied by an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme events. Two particular extreme events, heat waves, extreme precipitation events, are something that we need to be concerned about. And you remember 2003 when there was a heat wave in Paris and the surrounding areas, what devastation and what loss of life it actually led to. So this is something that we cannot ignore, and while Paris has set the target of 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century as the goal that global society must follow, the reality is that we're not going to reach that goal with the commitments that were made in Paris. And it's also true that even with the 2-degree increase in temperature, we'll have some terrible impacts of climate change, which really speaking, we should reduce, and we should make sure that the risks from it are minimized. Next. Now, this gives you the increase in sea levels. The sea level is increasing because of thermal expansion of the ocean and because of melting of bodies of ice across the globe. And I've been to the Arctic region Many times I've been to Greenland, and you have just to see things quite apart from what science tells you and actual measurements provide. The reality is so apparent before your eyes that you can't possibly ignore it. And the sea level rise since the beginning of the last century till 2010 has been an average of 19 centimeters. Mention was made earlier of the Maldives Islands, of Kiribati, and the other small island states in the Pacific. Can you imagine people living on these islands with a 19 centimeter increase in sea level and with the impacts of storm surges and other events that take place, extreme events that take place? People are really living in a state of fear. And that has something to do with our concern for their mental health. Next. This gives you an increase in the concentration of greenhouse gases. And the one which is labeled as green, which really shouldn't be green, is carbon dioxide. You can see how rapidly it's increasing. Below that is methane, and below that is nitrous oxide. So the concentration of greenhouse gases is going up very rapidly. At the beginning of industrialization, we had 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now it's well over 400 parts per million. So that is really something that has to be turned around, and the sooner we do it, the better. Next. This shows you the sources of carbon dioxide emissions, and you can see this large black area, which is the result of burning of fossil fuels, cement production, and flaring of natural gas. And then below that is the yellow area, which is on account of land use change and deforestation. You see the huge amount of carbon dioxide that we've put into the atmosphere as a result of burning of fossil fuels, cement production, and flaring of natural gas. The bulk, of course, comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So if we really want to tackle this problem, we have to move away from the fossil fuel age. Now, this is something that, you know, there are vested interests which will resist. And I can tell you, I've been a victim of that. But, you know, if you have a conviction based on science, you just have to articulate it. And you really need to tackle these forces head on. There's no choice. Next. Okay. This is an extremely important picture because it shows you how at the beginning of industrialization, if we had calculated how much emission could have taken place to ensure that temperature increase does not go beyond 2 degrees by the end of this century, we would have got a budget of 2,900 gigatons of CO2. By 2011, we had used up 1,900 gigatons. And today, if you were to carry out an estimate, is probably close to 2,100 gigatons of CO2. So all we're left with is about 800 or maybe 900 gigatons of CO2, which is part of our budget. And that will get exhausted very soon. And once you do that, then clearly you're on the path of a temperature increase by the end of the century, which will be far above 2 degrees Celsius. And that, to my mind, will lead to all kinds of disaster. And health, of course, is an extremely important component of the impacts of climate change, because as we've heard, there's an increase in vector-borne diseases as a result of extreme events. Again, let me refer to what happened in 2003 with the heat wave in Paris and around. There's mortality, there's morbidity, and you read a lot of news these days about landslides, about floods as a result of extreme precipitation events. That in itself is a major danger to human health and well-being. And let me also emphasize the fact, this was referred to earlier, that we're going to see many more people being displaced as a result of climate change. Now that will happen both on account of the physical impacts of climate change, but also because agriculture is being affected adversely. So with a growing population, which who knows may reach 10 billion at some stage in this century or maybe more, we're going to have much less food because the yields for the main crops is going to reduce substantially. And this is where, may I submit, I talk to various audiences and I tell them, if you eat less meat, you will be healthier and so would the planet. Because the meat cycle is extremely intensive in the emissions of greenhouse gases. And I know other speakers are going to talk about it. They are more qualified to get into this subject. But I believe that it is the youth of the world that are going to make a difference. And if they don't, it's their future which is really going to be jeopardized by the impacts of climate change. So I turn to what I show as the last slide. Next. Yeah, this is it. I've launched something called the POP movement, Protect Our Planet, which focuses on youth. There are 1.8 billion young people between the ages of 10 and 24 in the world. And if they don't take the lead, then I'm afraid we will be overwhelmed by climate change and its impacts, and it may be too late to reverse things. And we will be left with irreversible impacts that we're not going to be able to do anything about. So my appeal to everyone is to mobilize the youth of the world. My appeal is to see that not only we use institutions like high schools, colleges, universities as centers where you can show how you can bring about mitigation of emissions of greenhouse gases, adapt to the impacts of climate change, but at the same time bring about lifestyle changes. And those lifestyle changes would certainly involve some changes in diets as well. So this is what we have before us as a challenge, and if we don't accept it and implement it soon enough, then I'm afraid it's going to be a bit too late. So thank you very much. We can do it. I think the opportunities are there. Renewable energy technologies are looking extremely attractive, and they're going to become economically far more viable in the years ahead. Let's look at what the future is going to provide us by way of choices and adopt them today. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Johnny. Thank you for your interesting presentation. I have a question. Do you know the rationale behind the 2-degree cap? Why not 1 degree? Why not 2.5? And what are the risks that we can incur at 2 degrees? Thank you.
I think that's a very good question. I think that target has been set largely as a result of convenience and negotiations by all the governments of the world where they found that this is something that was acceptable to everyone. Now, I don't know if it will be acceptable to the new occupant of the White House because he believes that climate change is a Chinese conspiracy. And I was asking audiences in Mexico whether I have a resemblance to any kind of a Chinese conspirator, because this is something that I have made the work of my life over the last 30 years. So you're right. I mean, there's really no scientific basis. In my view, if you look at the impacts of climate change, we should be somewhere near 1.5 degrees, if not less, because the impacts, even with 2 degrees, are going to be pretty serious. I can certainly discuss some of them with you at any stage. Thank you. That's a good question.
Please step up to the podium. Thank you.
What is it that you think the young people of the world should be asking for? Is it that they should be asking all of us to have a simpler style of living? Or is it that they should be asking for faster development of greener technologies, greener storage, and for mechanisms to penalize at the financial level the companies who pollute via their greenhouse gases?
I think we really need a combination of everything. I mean, we've become a very wasteful society. And I think we need to change our values. We can do that also if there's far more rational pricing of the things that we produce and consume. It's interesting to know that James Baker, the former Secretary of State in the US, Hank Paulson, who was Secretary of Treasury, these are Republicans, and a few others, have developed a paper which they've submitted to the new president asking him to introduce a carbon tax in the economy. Now, we know that's not going to happen. But I think if you had a carbon tax, then clearly some of the consumption that is intensive in CO2 emissions would certainly reduce. And you're using a market mechanism to do that. But at the same time, we certainly need a change in our value systems. And this doesn't mean that we give up the good things in life, but it really means that we have to be a little more conscious of our carbon footprint. We waste a lot of energy, we waste a lot of goods and services. I mean, I wear clothes which are still 40 years old. And these are not entirely out of fashion, because fashion often comes back after 40 years. So, but I can't throw them away. And my family finds me a real pest in not doing that. However, I think we have become an extremely wasteful society. And I never go to a shopping mall simply because it's there to trap you, to tempt you to buy something or the other. I think if we're all conscious of our carbon footprints, we'll find ways by which we can ensure that we minimize it. And there, I have a lot of faith in young people. They will find innovative ways by which they can do that.
You make a very important point about this issue of reusing and recycling, and I've often heard of the term the circular economy. Perhaps that's another aspect that could be more integrated into what we teach our young people. I guess many youngsters are used to the concept of use, throw away, buy new, and so if that's not instilled in them at a very young age, they will develop into mass consumers. And of course, the whole world is advancing in that direction. So what sort of interventions do you think we could put in place to encourage the use of the circular economy?
I think we really need to bring about awareness among the public on where the waste from our systems today actually go and how these are part of a circular economy. Kenneth Boulding, who again was a very bold visionary economist, came up with the concept of a spaceship economy. We're all in a spaceship. There's nothing you can throw out. It's all going to stay there on this very planet. And at some stage, you're going to have to pay a price for it, even if you shut your eyes to it today. So I think this is an extremely good point. And I think we need to create awareness, particularly among youth. I mean, there are young people today living in cities who don't know where milk comes from, and who don't know where waste goes that's collected and, you know, sent off to landfills and so on. In my country, India, there's 7,500 landfills all over the country. Pretty soon, we'll run out of space. I'll just end with a little anecdote. Mahatma Gandhi was once asked, wouldn't you want India to be as prosperous as Britain? And he says, well, it required Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. How many planets would a country like India require? So I think we really need to understand that whatever we throw away is actually going to come back to us in some form or the other.
Thank you. And of course, one of the major challenges that we face is this so-called Great Wall that is to be constructed between the US and Mexico. I don't think that will act as a carbon sink somehow. I think it will generate even more CO2. Any more questions from the audience? Please step up to the mic. We have time.
May I speak French? Je voudrais demander au conférencier s'il a connaissance de programmes éducatifs dans les collèges, les lycées, qui déjà parlent de ces questions et de leur efficacité auprès des jeunes.
I think I'm going to need that. My French isn't as good as it was when I was a schoolboy, so I think we need some translation help with that.
Yes, unfortunately, you know, there's a lot of awareness in a number of institutions on the reality of climate change and what it's going to do. But there's a huge gap in terms of the right kind of teaching material, the kind of knowledge that could be understood and assimilated by students and teachers. So as part of the POP movement, we prepared a lot of teaching material which will be available essentially free of cost to everyone who wants to use them. And I think in the absence of that, you're not going to get focused action, you will not get proper appreciation of the seriousness of the problem and the kinds of solutions that could be implemented by youth. I'll end by just giving another little anecdote. There's a friend of mine whose son spent 2 months as an intern in my institute, and he was so motivated that when he went back to his institution in Delhi, which is the largest private high school in Delhi, has about 4,000 students, he launched a program to reduce the cost of electricity used in that school. And within 6 months, they were able to reduce the electricity bill by about 20%. Now, I think every school, college, university was to attempt things like this, installation of rooftop solar where it's viable and so on, then I think you would not only have knowledge that is available in the classroom, but something that can be translated into action. And to my mind, that will have a very powerful effect throughout society. And I think we need to educate youngsters. To answer your question, there aren't too many programs of this nature, as far as I know.
Thank you. One more question, please.
Hello, I will try to speak in English. Do you think that our Occidental governments and international organizations are ready to let us, I mean the young population, have a change our lifestyle in a greener way? I don't know if my question is clear.
No, the question is very clear, and I think it's a very relevant question because, you know, if you look at the advertising budget all over the world, I believe it's somewhere in excess of $600 billion, and it's going up very rapidly. Nature doesn't have any advertising at all. It's also true that democracies, not just in the developed world, but also in the developing world, are now in the grip of vested interests. Companies and corporations that just want to maximize their profits. I mean, in the US, you have a president who's wanting to bring back coal. Fortunately, that won't happen because natural gas prices are very low at this point of time, and the coal industry is in a shambles. But the fact is that these lobbies are extremely powerful, and I know that. Take it from me based on my personal experience. Therefore, it is extremely important that young people take their destiny into their own hands and start moving forward. Because some of these vested interests have to be taken head on. Otherwise, you know, you'll get the kind of global picture that was presented in Davos early this year. 8 people owning 50% of the wealth owning wealth of 50% of the people on this planet. To my mind, that's a shame. That's really not the kind of development that the world needs. So we have to fight against vested interests. That's the only way we can bring about change. And here again, I think it's the youth of the world who can really take on the powerful vested interests.
Thank you.
I think there are good biofuels and bad biofuels. What's happening, for instance, in the US, where you have an ethanol program, that largely has a political orientation. And if you look at the environmental and even the economic implications of it, it's really a distortion. I think what we really need to do is to spend a lot more effort and resources in developing 3rd and 4th generation biofuels. And I'm afraid the world is not doing enough. But overall, in the future, I believe if you develop the right technologies, you can come up with biofuels which are not only economically attractive, but would also have minimal or zero environmental impacts. But currently we're on the wrong track, and I think that needs to be corrected.
When do you predict the fossil fuel exhaustion will start to make an impact in the opposite direction on CO2 levels? How many years do we have any accurate prediction tools, any modeling which is realistic?
Well, it was Sheikh Yamani, who was the oil minister of Saudi Arabia in the 70s, who said that the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones. And I frankly think we need to bring about a transition even before fossil fuel resources are exhausted. We just need to keep them in the ground. And there'll always be some use of fossil fuels, oil in particular, natural gas as well, because they can be utilized for producing a whole range of materials and so on. But to use them as a fuel would be a mistake. So I think we need to bring about a transition well before you reach the age of a peak in oil production. And that is something which requires political courage. It requires effort on the part of civil society, which takes me to what the earlier question was. I think even as far as business is concerned, I think civil society now has to put pressure on those companies that are irresponsible in terms of their carbon footprint.
Of course, those companies will argue that the world's population is rapidly expanding and they need to feed all these people. So you have this balance, this difficult balance between feeding the people and obviously considering the environment.
But you know, what has been shown over here is if you want to feed the people with meat, I mean, I was shocked to learn the amount of meat that an average American consumes today. 271 pounds per year, an average American. Now, the question is, if you were to move to a much lower consumption of meat, then I think you have enough food grains in the world to take care of a growing population. We need a change in dietary patterns and dietary habits.
Yesterday we heard about the mudslides in Colombia and further loss of life. And of course, a lot of universities and companies are developing breeds of crops that can actually develop deeper roots and keep the topsoil better and prevent loss of topsoil and obviously reduce the risks of flooding. And I think that's another message we can send to our young people, that there are exciting careers in science. There are very important things they can do to change the world. And I'm not really sure we're doing enough of that as academics.
Yeah, frankly, these adaptation measures are not getting the kind of attention they deserve. I mean, whether it's agriculture or, you know, dealing with extreme events, we're really not doing enough, even in terms of early warning systems that can make an enormous difference in terms of saving lives. If I may have just a minute on the issue of vegetable diet versus a meat diet. If you want specialist opinion, there's a guy called an elephant who could give you advice on that. And if that's still not convincing, you can go to a guy called a horse who's pretty muscular. And if that still doesn't convince you, then there's a creature which has an alimentary canal like ours, and he's called a gorilla. So I think they do all right with a vegetarian diet. Well, I don't know if one can be learned about an issue like this, but, you know, I personally think we're at a point where change is essential and urgent. And we need to look desperately at means by which we bring about that change. I gave you the numbers of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, in the last 3 years, they've been more or less stable across the world. That's also because of economic reasons. But we know that they're going to take off. It's just a matter of time. They're going to start increasing very rapidly all over again. We need to talk to politicians, no question about it. And we need to inform them. And the good news is there are some good politicians. I mean, they don't always have enough clout. They don't have enough of a voice. But they are there somewhere, so we've got to enlarge that group by making efforts. And academics have to treat this as an important part of our responsibilities. We're living in a world where science and knowledge really has enormous power. And we're living in a world where perhaps access to knowledge is so much easier today. So unless we make it available, unless we make it accessible to politicians, then we have failed. Businesses need to be kept honest. But this is where I believe youth can certainly play a part. I mean, I'm not going to mention a product. Yesterday somebody asked me, so-and-so company is selling a particular product which we know is harmful. I said, if young people say we're not going to buy this, it's going to have a major impact because, you know, it's going to hurt that company in a way that they'll have to change. So I think we really need to use all kinds of channels. We need action by the youth. We need youth to indulge in much greater advocacy. I think academics have to get involved in informing the public. I mean, when I was in the IPCC, I used to tell my colleagues that we need a much more proactive outreach program. And they would say, look, it's your job to save the world. We are only interested in publishing our papers and, you know, doing research. They changed over the years that I saw. Now we certainly have a much better outreach program in the IPCC. But, you know, there are mindsets that need to be changed. And I think academics have to take on this challenge.